I mean, so is part of it that just what their own personal understanding is, let's say, whatever the issue is.
We showed prepared manuscripts.
No, I understand, but I'm saying that they had a problem with understanding the figures, so they said, well.
Sometimes they did
It
that.
doesn't make sense to me
That's-
based on my understanding of the
This is
issue.
something that Rebecca Town was very upset about. If you read the instructions, take very but but all the Rishonim also prepared manuscripts. I mean, they said what manuscript is this? They were what makes sense. So it's not a modern.
So, but then again, then you run into this issue just like they send out copies and then they decide, oh, I changed my mind.
It's all.
I feel like it's very slow moving right now.
There's no
Yeah, you know, they say out is come. So you ask a young guy like this, he's probably warm.
No, there's that very nice one quotes. Yeah. Is the screen shares on the Zoom? Are you sure? Let me sign in and make sure it's got the right thing.
Okay.
Is the camera on?
The
No, it is. Looks like it is.
okay
Let me just make sure that the Zoom screen is showing.
should be okay.
That's good. Never be able to show up on Zoom.
I think it's
Cell reception. This room is not so good. It looks like some. I just want to make sure that that's showing the right thing.
You don't need your glasses.
I know. Mark guy. Not sure. Yeah, okay, that's good. But I just want to make sure that the screen is showing the right. Zoom. Should I sign in on the?
I can give you the bait Wi-Fi.
Sure. I'm showing the network. Sure.
I got it.
By the regular Wi-Fi or guest?
1 second. Yes. I got it. To have bait event there. Celebrate one. Capital C.
Yep. There we go. No, so it's not sharing the right screen. You stop. Here, watch this. Let me do the new share. Let me do a new share. Do it like that. Yeah. There you go. That's good.
Okay. If you do
Hold on.
Alt H.
Yep.
This will bring up the comments. Should somewhere. No, I can share the PDF if you want.
Oh, I thought you said it's already there.
But if people sign in,
Oh, I
if
see.
people sign in, they won't see it. You have, I'll do it one more time and then it'll be.
Hi.
Hi, so I wasn't here last week. Let's say the the thing online is only audio. So the images are up.
Yeah.
What about for the?
Not for the first one's audio only. The audio, just only audio.
But you have like the images like this video now, like the stuff you posted. No, I mean like stuff there.
It's not online. I'm trying to find it. You know,
Mark, the Zoom is working fine.
Okay, great. Okay.
Right, like what I want, because the whole thing is that it's very visual.
I mean, it's pretty easy.
You started reading.
Oh, wow. I have not read it in a long time. All right, so. Okay. All right.
Somebody just said they.
Okay, great. Excellent, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, I probably won't.
Okay.
It's just to get other people speaking. We'll figure something first. Great. All right, thanks everyone for coming to the last of these series. It's been fun for me to put all this stuff together. I do hope one day to make more of it available in writing, although that we'll have to wait some time. So tonight I want to walk through the last of the Rambam's works, major halakhic works. We spent a lot of time on the Parsha Mishnah, mostly because that is the manuscript that we have with it, Rambam's own autograph, called the fair copy, as I talked about last week. But in fact, if the Sefer Mitzvot and certainly the Mishnah Torah lends itself to similar kinds of analysis that we've been doing so far. That is, that if you read the manuscripts, the reception history, the printed editions, and the commentaries certainly on the Mishnah Torah and the Sefer Mitzvot, you get very similar pictures of the development of Maimonidean thought. So if you take this kind of analysis and realizing that the Rambam did not sort of come into the world a finished product, but over time was developing ideas and rethinking things and constantly revisiting earlier claims. If you understand that, take that as a given and read the Rishonim and the manuscripts, and many of which are available online. These Sefer Mitzvot and the Mishnah Torah certainly lend themselves to this kind of thinking as well. So what I want to do in tonight, I'm putting all my cards on the table. This is going to be the most technical of the lectures, and that is the most sort of Beit Midrash learning style. Certainly the latter part of it. But hopefully that will show you not just that in terms of as I said already before, that learning and critical thinking, critical sort of analysis of the Maimonidean text can go hand in hand, but also sort of give you an insight into how the Rambam, at least what we can reconstruct, may have learned himself and developed his own thinking and learning. So what I want to do is take you through a few examples of the kind of changes and edits and changes in thinking that are evident in the Sefer Mitzvot, ideas that pertain to the Sefer Mitzvot, and show you them sort of one by one, hopefully getting a larger picture of the project of Sefer Mitzvot as a whole. But these examples will sort of be standalone. So we'll take them as a unit. I think there's 5 different things I want to tackle. And the technical stuff doesn't start till page 3. So here we go. All right. So obviously, the major category of Sefer Mitzvot is this amorphous category of mitzvah, right? We use the term mitzvah, or the Chazal use the term mitzvah in all sorts of different ways, right? They use it to mean a sort of they use it as the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613, right? That's something we're all familiar with. They can use the word mitzvah to mean it's a good thing, as in the phrase mitzvah v'lo la'akev, right? That it's something that should be done, but it's not absolutely necessary, right? We can find other uses of the term mitzvah in sort of common parlance, right? That we sort of use the word mitzvah. Oh, it's a mitzvah. It's a good thing to do, right? I mean, whatever. Like we use it sort of loosely, and this seems to be fairly common. Not just for us, for obviously Chazal. It doesn't seem like they're super concerned with using the word mitzvah in a very narrow, specific way. That's certainly the case. But if you look at the Sefer Mitzvot, one of the Rambam's very big concern is sort of defining the category mitzvah and limiting that category to obviously 613 entries on the list. Right? That's not such a surprising outcome, but that analysis led to certain changes. That's the first kind of set of changes we're going to see that lend itself to certain changes in the way the Rambam formulated his ideas. And obviously, the Rambam wasn't first interested in the category of mitzvah when writing the Sefer Mitzvot. Some of this stuff does come up in the Parashah Mishnah, such as source number 1. And this is the Parashah Mishnah Menachot, chapter 4. Who knows what mitzvah comes up here? Chapter 4 Menachot. Anyone guess? Right, Tzitzit and Lavan. Right, Tchelet and Lavan. Right, so here we have in source number 1, the Rambam telling us that on just in the first line here, the mitzvah of Tzitzit has two different components, two different component commands, right? One is Lavan and one is Tchelet, right? So clearly in this formulation, in this passage in the Parashah Mishnah in Menachot, right, the Rambam is clearly aware of this idea, right? This is source number 1, that a mitzvah is a sort of unit being Tzitzit, right? And that Tzitzit has different parts, right? Tchelet, Lavan, maybe Mabos and other parts of the mitzvah of Tzitzit, right? All the sort of rules that are subsumed under the category of Tzitzit, right? But at least, generally speaking, the Rambam is certainly aware that we have a big category of mitzvah and parts of it that are going to be subsumed under that. But other times in the Parashah Mishnah, the Rambam is less definitive, perhaps, about, or less sort of technical in his uses of the word mitzvah. And here, I want to show you two other examples, both of which are fairly familiar from manuscripts. The first one should be familiar to us all now by week number 3. This is the draft of the Parashah Mishnah on Shabbat, right? We don't actually have, the fair copy doesn't survive, I mentioned, it's missing all of Seder Tarot. It's also missing the first part of Seder Moed, including, unfortunately, Shabbat and Eruvin, right? But we do have the draft of Shabbat. We do have the copies of the fair copy of Shabbat. So we can sort of get pretty close. But either way, in the draft, and this is source number 2, the Rambam tells us in Mesachot Shabbat, right? And this is preserved also in the later copies of this tractate. He says, maybe it's a little technical here, a little harder to read, excuse me. It says, Hadlakat ner b'Shabbat mitzvah, right? Lighting candle on Shabbat is a mitzvah. Now, is that a mitzvah in the most technical sense of the term? No, obviously not, right? But it's used in sort of the maybe more colloquial formulations of the term. And also, in the Parashah Mishnah and Eruvin, this again also is not preserved in the Rambam's handwriting, but from a copy, there's no reason. I mean, and all the copies are more or less the same thing, right? He says in the second line here, it's in Arabic, so we'll read in English. He says, "This mitzvah." This is on the source number 3. This eruv is a mitzvah, right? Making an eruv chatzerot is a mitzvah, right? And then he says, "Mitzvot lo," or as we would say, lav lehenot nitnu, right? Mitzvot are not subject to the rules of deriving benefit or not deriving. Okay, regardless of what that's the whole very complicated sugya.
That's the term that you're using. It's the here. Reference only to the Raisa type mitzvahs.
Well, they're clearly not, right? Clearly, because lighting candles on Shabbat and eruv is not a doraisa, right? Those are rabbinic mitzvot, as we
Right. That's what
exactly. But my point. That's my point, right? The Rambam is not using them in a very in a sort of technical, limited haryad doraita sense. He's clearly using them much more broadly. But when we skip down, when we see the similar passages in the Mishnah Torah are a little bit different. So in Hilchot Shabbat, beginning of chapter 5, here you see a manuscript, just because it's pretty, right? The Rambam tells us, this is source number 4, Habakat ner b'Shabbat ino rashut im ratza madlik im ratza ino madlik, right? Lighting candles on Shabbos is not some optional thing. You know, if I need a light, I can light a candle. If I don't need a light, I don't need a candle, right? And then he says, this is the important line, v'lo mitzvah she'enu v'lo mitzvah, and neither is lighting candles on Shabbat a mitzvah. She'enu chayav l'rdof achareha ad she'asena, and you don't have to run after and do it until it's to see that it's done. Unlike Kigon, Erev Chatzir, only to let you die in Lachila. Unlike these other rabbinic rules, which are obligatory, that you do have to run after, right? Ela, what is lighting candles on Shabbat? It's a chova. And so this is a pretty ambiguous statement. It seems like something we should be very clear as to what it means, but it's when you drill down here and you try to understand these words, right? It's not really clear what these categories are, right? The Rambam says lighting candles on Shabbos is not an optional, not a reshut, nor is it a mitzvah that you have to do. Rather, it's a chovah. It's an obligation. I don't really know what it means. This problem here is what's the difference between chovah and a mitzvah, right? Especially if you define the word mitzvah as something you have to do, right? I don't really know. I don't have an answer to this question, but it is incredibly interesting when the Rambam is defining this term. He's like going out of his way to say, "Oh, it's not really a mitzvah," right? Even though he's earlier categorized it as a mitzvah, right? In contrast to another term that he categorizes as a mitzvah, meaning erov, here he says is a mitzvah. So what's going on here? Why are these changes made? Yeah.
I was gonna ask that. You, before it's not an obligation, have to have it, but washing your hands is rather not really.
Right. So it's erov. It's also derabbanan, right? If you want to do it, you have. There certainly, and there's a lot of things that are ambiguous.
Is something you have to do, not putting it in the midst of the Torah.
Right. Absolutely.
And with Eruv Chatzerot
Exactly.
is if you want to have.
Yeah, agreed. I don't have an answer to all these questions. I just want to put them on the table. If you actually look in source number 5 in the handout, right from the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, right, when he lists the Taryag mitzvot, he tells us all the 613, right? I've been asked to read more of the sources myself just for the sake of the recording, but I won't do that entirely. But it certainly sometimes, right, I will do that. He tells us, right, these are the Taryag mitzvot that were set at Sinai, etc., etc. There are other mitzvot that are, and he uses the word mitzvah here, that were innovated after the giving of the Torah, established by the prophets and sages, and spread among all Israel, right? Other mitzvot that are post Matan Torah, like Megillah, Hanukkah, Tisha B'Av, washing your hands, and Eruvin. What's missing from this list? Shabbat, right? Ner Shabbat. But clearly, the Rambam has come up with some distinction between Shabbat and Eruv, and it's such that he's moving away, right? Somehow the lighting candle on Shabbat has moved away from the term mitzvah to something a little more, a little different, chovah, whatever that means, right? And if you look at the beginning of source number 6, the beginning of Hilchot Eruvin, where he tells us there's one mitzvah, which is Divrei Sofrim, which is rabbinic, Eino Mina Minyan, right? So it's not part of from the 613. So why is the Rambam so concerned? So I don't quite know how we're supposed to explain the difference between Eruvin and Tzilat Yadayim on the one hand, why those are more mitzvah style than Shabbat. But it is important here. I think the answer is fairly clear. Right? If you look in source number 7, this comes up in a few places in Sefer Mitzvot, and this is why it's relevant, obviously, to what we're discussing. The Rambam has a whole discussion about, and this is going to come up over and over again, how do you count the mitzvot? How do we count the particular mitzvah here of related to Keter Chamor, right? A newborn donkey. There are two related obligations, right? You can either, they don't know what they are, what can you do? Or break its neck or redeem it. So if you were counting the mitzvot, how would you treat that? That's it's redemption. How do you do it? Maybe you'll just maybe you have one mitzvah of Keter Chamor. Right. Okay. Maybe you could say it like that. What about the? This is going to come up in a second. Also, what about Yibum and Chalitza? Right. How many mitzvot would you count when you have Yibum and Chalitza? Is that one or two mitzvot? Do you think? Sounds like one. Why does it sound like one? It's one or the other, right? Sounds like one or the other. Okay. Who disagrees? Who agrees and disagrees at the same time is the Rambam, right? The Rambam thinks you're right. And what has been said now makes sense, logically speaking, but it's incorrect at the end of the day. His reasoning is very strange. Who wants to read source number 7 from positive mitzvah number 82? Yeah. Please? Yeah.
Sure. One can ask, why did you count redemption of a donkey and breaking its neck as 2 mitzvot, not one? That breaking its neck would be an instantiation.
Instantiation. That's my fancy word for the Arabic term here. It doesn't really matter. That.
Of the mitzvah, as explained in Principle 7.
Right. So the question is, why did the Rambam ask himself this question? Why did you count the pidyon and the arifa, the redemption and the breaking the neck as 2 mitzvot? and not one. It should be one there, like one manifestation, one instantiation of a single mitzvah. So what's the Rambam's answer?
God knows that this is reasonable.
Yeah, this makes sense. You're right, Mitzvah. Logically speaking, of course, there should be one mitzvah, except
Except if you find their statement that these are two mitzvahs. The commandment of redemption is preferable to the commandment of neck breaking. And the commandment of Hebrew is preferable to the commandment of chalitza.
so the Rambam's answer for why he counts two mitzvot here, pretty obvious, right? It's pretty simple, not so simple at all, but it's pretty simple. At least it's presented this way at this moment, right? He quotes the Mishnah in Bechorot, right? The mitzvah of pidyon Peter Chamor is preferable to the mitzvah of Arifat Peter Chamor, right? It's one mitzvah is preferable to the next, just as the mitzvah of Yibum is preferable to the mitzvah of Chalitza. Now, when I read this Mishnah, right, without knowing the Rambam, I wouldn't have taken the words mitzvah so seriously, right? Not at all. But the Rambam, it's not the only place the Rambam does this. In the Sefer Mitzvot, several times, he will say, oh, the Chazal used the word mitzvah, it must be used in the technical sense, as in one of the Taryag mitzvot. Right? So the Rambam doesn't always, there are exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, the Rambam defends counting certain things that seem like they should be one mitzvah as two mitzvot, if Chazal treated as one. It's treated as two. They use the word mitzvah twice. So if Chazal use the word mitzvah twice, the Rambam is going to use the word mitzvah twice. The Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvot, all of a sudden, is using the term mitzvah to mean something not a good deed, not like it's something ideal, right? But a technical term as one of the Taryag mitzvot. So all of a sudden, in the Sefer Mitzvot, and I think this explains the change in emphasis, the change in explanation, the change in description in regarding Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat, the way Shabbos candles, right? Is because he's aware that the word mitzvah means something very technical. For the Rambam, it means one of the Taryag, or maybe one of the things that's extra. But whatever it is, Shabbat candles are not all of a sudden part of those mitzvah, right? So I think so when we see when you just look at the Rambam critically, you see him over time, you can see this change. You can explain this change. I think this is the most reasonable explanation, because he's changing the way he wants to mean the word mitzvah. Yeah. Does he need help getting to? I think the problem with the minyan mitzvot is not getting to 630, but getting down from whatever the number should be, what it seems like the number is. Why does he use the word? Why is he define the word? It's a good question. Because there are other places where it's useful. And I think he sort of backed himself into a corner, maybe. The truth is, the Rambam is, though, he says this very strongly in many, many places, but it's very clear if you read all the Chazal, if you read Chazal when they use the word mitzvah, compared to what the Rambam is somewhat selective. So he is using other factors, but it's a factor. And I think he thinks it's a reasonable factor. I think Chazal used the word mitzvah to define all four of the Daled needed, right? Each one is a mitzvah, right? Etrog, Hadassim, Rabbo, Lulav, whatever, each one is a mitzvah. But the Rambam counts only one. Almost all the Monei mitzvah, only one person counts more than one there. So the Rambam is able to escape that word on occasion, but generally speaking, he wants to use it. That question, yeah.
Is the enumeration of Sefer Mitzvot and Mishnah Torah identical?
Yeah, yes, although we'll see some, yes, as we have it. Yeah.
Does the Rambam say that
Yeah, but a bracha, the rules relating to bracha are different than the rules related to mitzvot, like what's a mitzvah. But that it does actually, other Rishonim actually ask this very question, not from a mitzvah perspective, but from a minhag and source. It's really not clear what the source of the mitzvah of the bracha, of the obligation to say bracha on Shabbos is. That's not, as far as I know, family Shabbos. Yeah.
And not that the Rambam says that he didn't say from himself first, so we can organize it to be.
Yeah, so the relationship of these texts is much more complicated than the Rambam on in those passages. Yeah. Oh, so let's take another example. This one we've seen already, at least the passage, right? I hope this was actually from the very first discussion. I had this this very small change in the Parish Mishnah in Nazir, or I think as the Rambam likes to call it, Mesechet Zirut, as far as I remember, right? We saw this change, right? The Rambam it used to say Ein halacha Rabbi Shimon, and the Rambam ve'ein halacha Rabbi Shimon, and the Rambam changed it to v'halacha Rabbi Shimon, right? A very slight change that if we peel back the layers of the onion, we see that there's way more going on here. Right. So this is another change that pertains to the Rambam's analysis of the minyan mitzvot, although this one is a little more complicated. So let's take a look at the Mishnah in Nazir that the Rambam is discussing here. Who wants to read the Mishnah Nazir parak above Mishnah Bet for us? This is very relevant. A lot of people will see. This was not intentional, but everyone started learning Nazir, and half the examples are going to do with Nazir. So it's very exciting for everybody. Okay, please. Yeah, whatever. So basically, right? We are familiar with some of the basics of this process, right? The Nazir wants to end his Nazirut, right? He comes up and he does a whole ceremony. Okay, that's what the mission tells us. So then what's the Tanakhama's position? The next sentence. Right. So once you've done all the korbanot and all the whole thing, and you've shaved and et cetera, you can go and your Nazirut is over. You can go home and enjoy yourself and drink wine and be merry, I guess. Okay. So that's the Tanakhama's position. What's Rabbi Shimon's position? About to say one of the bloods, excuse me. Yeah, so a pretty standard machloka in the Mishnah, right? According to the Tanakhama, the Nazir has to undergo the entire process to allow him to permit him to drink wine, right? And according to Rabbi Shimon, just one step of the process is enough to sort of undo the Nazir, right? Not surprising, Rabbi Shimon Mekel, that's a pretty standard position of Rabbi Shimon for a chas, right? So in the Parsha Mishnah, on this very discussion, the Rambam changed his mind. One time he held, like the Chachamim, that the Nazir needs to do the entire process, and then he changed his mind to say, no, Rabbi Shimon's right, only a little bit of the process is sufficient for the Rambam for the Nazir, to be able to drink wine, et cetera, right? Not super complicated, changing his mind. But in fact, when we look in the parallel passages in the Rambam, things get a little more complex, right? So here we have a passage in the Sefer HaMitzvot, source number 10. I guess I'll read this, and then we'll take turns, I guess. So right in Sefer HaMitzvot, mitzvah 111, mitzvah Aseh 111, the Rambam is discussing the purification process of Mitzorah, the purification process of a Nazir, etc., right? So he tells us the following: shaving and bringing the sacrifices permit drinking wine, right? That is, you need to do both. One is insufficient without the other. As the shaving is connected with the sacrifice with the shaving, right? All these things, the whole process needs to be done together. The desired result is achieved, permitting that which was forbidden as a Nazir. Together, they remove Nazirut, right? So here in the Sefer Mitzvot, who's the Rambam paskin like? Tanakhama, exactly, beautiful, right? He is saying, as we would think, Ein halakha Rabbi Shimon, right? He wrote this passage clearly before he wrote those two lines over the word ve'ein, right? Lo and behold, we turn to the Mishnah Torah, parallel discussion in the Mishnah Torah in source number 11, right? Who wants to read this? I don't know what who wants to read source number 11. Hilchot Nazir Parak Chet Halacha Hey.
He brings the sacrifices and did not shave his head. Shaving does not hold him back. Rather, he may drink and purify himself that night, because once the blood is sprinkled, these are permitted. Even though the objects were not placed on his hands nor waved, these rituals are ideal. They do not hold him back.
Lemitzvah v'lo la'akev. Now the Rambam is paskin like Rabbi Shimon, right? He's changed his mind. Okay, this is not. I'm not offended by this. This is not going to bother anybody. The Rambam learned, right? He changed his mind. He one point was holding on to his Tanakhama, and that Tanakhama position is preserved in the Sefer HaMitzvot. And then in the Mishnah Torah, he said, "No, I want to hold like Rabbi Shimon for whatever reason." Exactly why we have to speculate about, right? But then in the Mishnah Torah, when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he crossed out the words ve'ein and he wrote v'halakha Rabbi Shimon, right? So we can then therefore date these two little squiggles over the word ve'ein to after the composition of the Sefer Mitzvot, before the Rambam wrote at least the final draft of the Mishnah Torah, right? This is attested. This passage is tested by the Rambam's son, Avram and Rambam discusses this very passage. He says, "Oh, my father changed his mind about this," right? We know it's very clear this will change, right? Why exactly is not, we don't know. But it is interesting, right, that if you look in even the best copies of the Sefer HaMitzvot, they all preserve the original position. So in this case, if you were to look at a good edition of the Parsha Mishnah, the Parsha Mishnah would line up with the Mishnah Torah, and the Sefer Mitzvot would not, right? But we can tell what happened here. What happened here was the Rambam originally passed like the Tanna Kamma, wrote the Tanna Kamma's position into the Sefer Mitzvot, changed his mind, when writing the Mishnah Torah, went back and fixed the Parsha Mishnah, but did not, as far as we know, fix the Sefer HaMitzvot. Now, why the Rambam changed his mind? Unclear. If you look at source number 12, it seems like the Gemara is poskening like, or says the majority position is like the Chachamim. So that would sort of be in line. But if that was the Rambam's proof text, we don't really know, but it could be. But it is also interesting, right, that it's not at all clear that this change would not affect the entire Taryag mitzvot, right? The Rambam seems to think that these are one mitzvah, shaving and the korbanot of the Nazir, because they have to come together. But it might be, if you sort of extrapolate from the Rambam's reasoning, if they don't have to come together, then they would be separate mitzvot, right? But when you're writing a Sefer Mitzvot, you've got very strict parameters, right? No one is going to take your book to press if you end up with 614, right? And I like to say that's sort of a little bit of a house of cards, and we'll see some other changes in a second that support this idea. That the Rambam clearly edited the Sefer Mitzvot even in such ways that impacted the numbering of the mitzvot, right? What they are, right? How many, what's what, right? But if you take one out, you better put one right back in, right? And things get very complicated because all the rules are sort of tied together, right? That's pretty obvious, right? If you take one out, you end up with 612. You got to quickly put one back in, and so if this change really didn't impact the numbering of the commandments, right? It would seem to reflect the Rambam sort of, if he knew this, and I can't answer this question definitively, right? If he had this realization, then it could be that he just stopped editing because he couldn't go back and fix every single thing. So it could be that some of the enumerations of the mitzvot, even though they're not always identical in the Mishnah Torah, and even though he doesn't spell it out, some of the changes that are made in the Mishnah Torah might have affected the writing of the Sefer Mitzvot in a way that would have led to real changes that the Rambam just didn't end up making. Yeah.
I am going as a change. Does it have anything to do with the approach towards the sun?
So I don't know. So if you look, so other changes, the Rambam does tell us that he is aware that the stam is important, and that the way that and the way that sort of the different layers of Gemara interact with each other. It could be. It could also be here. It's also interesting. I don't know the answer to why the Rambam changed here. It could be that it is striking that in the Mishnah itself, he paskins like the Tanna Kammas, assuming the majority position. But then if you look in the Gemara says the majority position follows Rabbi Shimon. That's certainly well, right? So the majority position is switched sides here. So it could be that the Rambam gave differing weight at certain points to the Mishnah, what the Mishnah positions as the majority to what the Gemara position is the majority. I don't know. It's hard to know. There are cases though that certainly that will come up. Okay, one other example before we get crazy technical, and here we have a nice picture of fruit. Right. Okay. I was looking for a good picture of this. There's surprisingly few pictures of halachic grapes on the internet. But this was also from alatorah.org, which is an incredible website that I endorse wholeheartedly. Okay, so another interesting phenomenon in the Sefer Mitzvot, right, that is sort of underemphasized, or it receives different kinds of emphases in different writings of the Rambam, is the concern with parshanut, right? The Rambam, if you read the Sefer Mitzvot, emerges as a very careful reader of Chumash, and I will see the next, from here to the end of this year, we'll see examples where the Rambam is where Mikra becomes very important. We even saw last week a little bit with the Avelut and Nidu example, where the Rambam is clearly attentive to different words and their meanings, and their ramifications of the halacha in various. So the example I want to show you pertains to the definition of olulot, right? People may not be so familiar. It's one of the agricultural mitzvot, right, that if like Shechicha and Peah, right, you're not allowed to collect certain things in your field. One of the things you're not allowed to collect, according to this Chumash Devarim, is olalot, right? Now the question becomes, what does olalot mean? If you right, if we want to understand what it means, we have to look at the Mishnah in Peah, right? So the Mishnah in Peah tells us, right, is olalot, right? Kol she'in lo ketef v'lo netef. I don't really know what those words mean, so I looked them up, and they tell us that they refer to different parts of the grape vine. You can see this picture on the slide here, right? This is on the right hand side. We have a nice, fully beautiful, developed grape, right? We've all at least picked this out in the store. I've never really seen one in real life, right? And next to it is an underdeveloped, right, grape, right, growth here, right? This set of grapes is going to grow a little more fully, right, into something on the right hand side. So according to the Mishnah, if it's lacking what the Mishnah calls a shoulder and pendant, which as far as I understand refers to the the grape will sort of grow it a little bit broader on top, and then it will grow a further vine to sort of hold it up closer to the vine. As far as I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong. Right, so those things happen obviously at a later stage as the grapes develop. Right, so according to the Mishnah in Olalot, right, if you right, you're allowed to pick the nice, juicy, yummy grapes on the right, but the ones on the left you have to leave over, right? And you're not allowed to pick them, right? Because they're it sounds like they are underdeveloped. But if you look in the Sefer Mitzvot, you get something totally different. The Rambam offers a very different understanding of the word Olalot than the Mishnah. And if you look at the Parsha Mishnah in Peah, there's no hint of this whatsoever, right? Only in the Sefer Mitzvot does this idea appear, as the Ramban is gonna point out. So most of the sources we're going to be dealing with the rest of the year come from Principle 9 in the Sefer Mitzvot. It is the most technical and complicated of the Shorashim in the Sefer Mitzvot, and merits careful study. But hopefully, so we're going to talk about some of the issues that come up in that Shoresh tonight. So, who wants to read this passage from source number 14 in principle number 9? Yeah.
Do not be confused about repeated prohibitions and different words, like do not collect or load after yourself. And when you forget the sheep in the field, do not return to collect it. And when we beat olive trees, do not go over them again.
Okay. So what does the Rambam think the word Olalot refers to here? Right? He compares it to other leftover, like not just leftovers, but Shechicha, Peah, things we're familiar with, right? Things you're not allowed to go back and collect. Yeah, it's all one, exactly. It's one concept, right?
Here's one concept. Earlier we talked about thing with the Rambam, right?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Right. This is the issue. This is the problem in Sefer Mitzvot. How do you group together concepts? This is the major issue with the entire work. Absolutely. Okay. Right. So here he says the Olalot refers to forgotten grapes, much like Shechicha and the example of olives, right? Forgotten grapes, things you have to that you've left over. Those are what you cannot go and collect. So what does he say? Just finish this off here.
These are not two prohibitions, but one dealing with one concept, do not get to be forgotten if you collect them. The Torah offers two examples,
Grapes and olives, that's all about forgotten fruit. This whole discussion of forgotten, it's all about forgotten fruit. Nothing, it doesn't seem like, maybe it's forgotten because it's small, you could argue, no, it's fundamentally, it's very different things, right? Fundamentally, one is like underdeveloped. If you had to sort of sum it up in one word, right? The Mishnah talks about underdeveloped grapes, and the Rambam talks about forgotten grapes. Okay? Fine. Now, yeah. No, correct. It sounds like it. Yeah. Yeah, you dropped it or something. It's not clear exactly. Yeah, sure. Okay, and you can look in the parallel discussion in the Sefer Mitzvot where the Rambam continues on this idea. But then, if you look in the Ramban, right? We'll talk about the Ramban again in a little bit. The Ramban obviously wrote the most important critical commentary on the Sefer Mitzvot, right? It's of great length and displays obviously immense care and learning. The Ramban is different than most of the commentators in the Sefer Mitzvot because he's much more critical of the Rambam than basically anyone else. He was closer in time, he was the Ramban, whatever the reason might be. But he tells us, not at this very spot, but before he gets to the Tarek Mitzvot, the Ramban, who wants to read source number 15, he tells us something very interesting here.
There are places, in this word mentioned as very true word, fits there, will remain wrong here.
Right. So there's times in the Sefer Mitzvot where he changed his mind to writing the Mishnah Torah, but he didn't go back and fix his mistake.
Like what he said in his time, it's all obvious error. This is his mistake, but it does not affect the count. His great word he wrote.
Right. So according to the Ramban, right, the Rambam made this huge mistake about defining olalot, right? But when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam got everything correct. And when you look in Sefer Zraim, in the Mishnah Torah, everything is hunky dory with the Mishnah. No hint of this abhorrent idea that olalot somehow doesn't mean underdeveloped, means forgotten. Okay.
Does 14 mean that Olaf is subsumed under Shitha?
Sounds like it, although it's not. It's a little more complicated than that, but it certainly sounds like it's very related to, if not subsumed under, but certainly very related to Shitha. Absolutely. Okay. So the question becomes, then you have to find the question, right? Why did the Rambam think this? Why? Why did the Rambam reject basically just a simple Mishnah? Right? It's totally bizarre. But why did the Rambam think that olalot doesn't mean underdeveloped grapes that lack whatever the ketef and netef is on this nice picture? Why did he think something else? Why did he think it meant shikha? Right? Although, right, to be fair to the Rambam, if one were to read the parshiot that discuss olalot and shikha, peah, and etc., it's not clear from Pshat that it's any different. Only based on the Mishnah does one think differently, right? I think that's a fair reading of Chumash, right? We don't know what the word olalot means, right? I don't know what it means. We have to look at the Mishnah to define it, right? So it could be, right? And I think it's not an unreasonable reading of Pshat that it does mean forgotten fruits, forgotten grapes in this case, right? On a Pshat level, even though Chazal are reading this differently. And lo and behold, if you look in source number 16, if you look in, this is maybe obscure to most people in this room, but it certainly was not obscure to the Rambam. The Sefer, what's known in Hebrew as the Sefer Shorashim, the Book of Roots, which is just a dictionary of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, right, by Yonah ibn Janach, who lived in the century before the Rambam in Spain, right? Yonah ibn Janach was a massive influence on anyone who came after, right? And certainly, if you want to understand any of the Parshanim in Spain, certainly, I mean, even before you get to the Rambam, certainly the Rambam, but if you look at Ibn Ezra, if you want to look at some of the lesser known but important figures, even Ibn Bal'am and other figures like that, Yonah ibn Janach was a massive influence on it. There's no question in my mind. The Rambam knew this work as well, right? He was familiar with the Sefer Shorashim of Yonah ibn Janach, right? And how does Ibn Janach define olalot? Right? It's exactly this: leftover grapes, right? So what we have here, I think, is an example of the Rambam understanding Pshat based on, and using that in the Sefer Mitzvot, based on Ibn Janach, right? An obscure source to us, but not to the Rambam in any way, shape, or form, right? And that explains this rather strange position to us that olalot doesn't mean underdeveloped, it means forgotten, right? And that is, in this idea that perhaps the Rambam was very interested in Pshat in Sefer Mitzvot lines up with other things that we know about Sefer Mitzvot, that it was very concerned with Mikra in a way perhaps that other works were not. So why the Rambam did this, I think the answer to this strange position, and we'll see more evidence on the next slide, in the next upcoming discussion about the Rambam's concern with Pshat. But by all accounts, when the Rambam was writing Sefer Mitzvot, Pshat and Mikra and Parshanut is like very important issues, very, very important issues, and they can even explain these sort of non-halakhic reasons, sometimes, or explanations the Rambam is going to give in the Sefer Mitzvot. Any questions about olalot before we get to the craziness?
So you're saying it's prioritizing the
Yes,
over
absolutely, right.
It's intentional, it's not a mistake.
I don't think it's a mistake. No, I mean the Ramban thinks it's a mistake because the Ramban is committed to, Torah Shabbat Peh in a way that the Rambam wasn't in these passages in the Sefer Mitzvot. And if you look, right, this also explains, right, the Rambam. I mean, this doesn't quite explain, but it's related to other issues in Maimonides thought about how the Rambam relates to Midrash, how the Rambam relates to Drasho, that Chazal is sort of pin one halacha on a Drasha and pin a different, right? The Rambam is going to give you a different picture, right? There's all sorts of questions related to Rambam's Parshanut is a major issue that we sort of forget because we're so much Ish Halacha. And I think this is an example of the Rambam's interest in Parshanut that comes to the fore mostly in favor of mitzvot, which is sort of the most daring of his works. Okay. Any other questions on this?
Just to defend the Rambam.
I don't know if to defend. I'm defending him too.
I'm saying, although indeed are underdeveloped.
They might be forgotten.
Not just that you go through the harvest what's there.
Yeah.
That's what's left behind.
I don't think the definitions, even an Ak's definition and the Mishnah's definition are not that far apart.
Yeah.
But the Rambam's clearly coming. Could say that they're related. You might just say, okay, they're related. But if you look at other passages, there are sort of clear enough communities between them. And the Rambam is much more interested in Pshat, perhaps, than what the Mishnah is offering. Okay. All right. So now I want to. Now we get to the. I thought that was easy. Wait till we get to this. Okay. So I promised you that we would discuss this massive note in the Parashah Mishnah in Makot, in the beginning of the third chapter. Okay, so as in many places in the Parashah Mishnah, the Rambam is not just interested in explaining the Mishnah; it's also interested in he has these massive discussions that are sort of programmatic in their scope, and sometimes very much setting the stage for his discussions in the Mishnah Torah and the Sefer Mitzvot later. We are familiar, perhaps, with the introduction to Parat Chelek in Sanhedrin, or the Shmona Prakim in the beginning of Avot, right? But these are longer and more theological, but they are only a small subset of these very frequent large discussions the Rambam has that are essentially tangents, maybe even standalone essays that the Rambam placed when discussing the Mishnah. And in the beginning of the third parak of Makot, perhaps no surprise to anyone in this room, the Rambam is interested in when does one get lashes when one does not. Right? And the Rambam goes through 6 or 7 different categories, exemptions from Makot that some that we can also name a few of them, lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, when you don't actually do an act, or it's something you can undo, like returning a stolen object. Those kind of things are not subject to lashes, right? The Rambam lays all the categories all there. And then in somewhere around here in the bottom of the right around here, if you can see the Rambam starts another discussion. This beginning of example number 6, source number 17, example 6 in the Mishnah. The Rambam just starts discussing this issue of lav shebechlalot, right? Lav shebechlalot ein lokin alav, right? There's no makot for violating a lav shebechlalot. I have not translated this term lav shebechlalot quite intentionally, because anyone who has seen this come up in its 10 or a dozen places in the Bavli where this is discussed knows that it's really not clear what this term means. Okay, and the Rambam himself is offering several definitions, and that's part of the issue here. But so what we have here in this note is the following. I talked about this last time from a little bit different perspective, right? So this discussion of lav shebechlalot starts around here, right? About, I don't know, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom, I think, if I counted correctly, right? He's discussing lav shebechlalot in this page, and then he offers a whole long discussion of the definition of lav shebechlalot. And in the middle of the sentence, as I said last time, he starts writing things on the side. Okay, right? He is, for whatever reason, decides not to write the next page. He starts writing this massive discussion on the side that I've just shown you the beginning of these 8 lines, right? If anyone with really good eyesight, make out the word mikol, asher, yaseh migefen hayayin, right? Anyone know what possible that's about, where that's from? Very important for us. Mikol, asher, yaseh migefen hayayin. Nazir, exactly. Right. So here we have the first 4 lines that are discussing one definition of lav shebechlalot. That's all part of this discussion that's on the body of the page. So what we have here then is the Rambam not going to the next page, but continuing discussion on the side, as I mentioned last time. And then sometime later, in smaller handwriting, and according to experts in medieval paleography, that is handwriting analysis, which I do not consider myself, certainly not one of them. This reflects sort of an older hand, someone a little more shaky, a little less strong hand when writing these words, right? The Rambam in smaller letters, we even plebs like me and you can see this, right? He discusses he says, wait a second, there's also another definition of lav shebechlalot, right? From this part of the laws that one does not receive makot for, that is lav shebechlalot. There's another definition of this, right? And he discusses this here. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's take a stab at this. So this is very helpful. We're going to use charts for this. Very helpful. So our say maybe a provisional definition of lav shebechalot is a prohibition, that is a do not statement, like, don't murder, that covers many different laws, right? I'm trying to leave that as intentionally vague. If that's clear to you, keep it vague as best you can, okay? So lo and behold, the Rambam is going to offer 3 different definitions, and we'll see them slowly over time. Okay, so let's start with the definition that appears in the Parsha Mishnah in the inside, sort of the big handwriting on the inside of the page. Who wants to read source number 17? Definition number 1. Okay, so how does he define lav shebechalot at the beginning of the Parsha Mishnah and Makkot?
Like they say in many places, this is not a statement to say that it's what, like, do not eat it, or roast it, or use it. Until the day you bring this up, to which derives the prohibition against all.
Okay, so the first definition, you see this on the board, and this is the one that's on the screen here, is an implied prohibition. The example the Rambam gives is, this first example that he gives us several others, is the definition, is the source of the Mishnah, of the prohibition of Chadash. Right, this is not practiced by most people in Chutzlaretz today, but it's certainly a biblical obligation with a long history. Right, this idea that, but the Rambam tells us no explicit prohibition of Chadash in the Torah. Rather, there's a prohibition of don't eat these kind of grains, from which derive a general prohibition. It sort of implies a general prohibition of Chadash. Okay, what is our second definition in the Parsha Mishnah? Take us home. Okay, we're all familiar with this ambiguous pasuk, lo tachlu al adam, right? How many isurim are there in lo tachlu al adam? 5, 6, 7, right? Different Gersot actually in the Rambam, but right there's a whole bunch, right? So therefore, now we have 2 definitions of lav shebechalot, right? And here we go in our Parsha Mishnah. We're going to keep building our chart. It's much more complicated on PowerPoint than it looks. Right in the Parsha Mishnah, then we have our first definition, which is an implied prohibition that appears in the body and continues on the side of the text. Right, and the second definition, a prohibition that covers many laws, lo tachlu adam, that is added to the side of the manuscript. Okay, now let's turn the page and see what the Rambam does with this in the Sefer HaMitzvot. Here I will show you, before we get to it, that the Rambam is going to do something a little bit different, right? Instead of discussing definition 1 and definition 2, definition 1 is going to appear only very tangentially. I didn't even put it on the source sheet, right? Very offhand remark. This, oh yeah, by the way, it also includes implied prohibitions. He's going to offer us the second definition, that is a lo tachlu adam, a prohibition that covers many laws. And then he's going to come up with a third definition, and that third definition is going to, take the cake, if you will. Okay, so let's take our who wants to read source number 18 from another passage in the middle of the 9th Shoresh in Sefer HaMitzvot, who hasn't spoken in a while. Strong desire to, please.
All right. Stipulation that we should count commanded and prohibited concepts is on the condition that the prohibited concept has a distinct do not for each concept, or evidence from the transmitters indicates that each concept is distinct from the next, and the do not refers to each one.
Okay, this is incredibly dense and technical language, but basically what he's saying is that we have this idea, we're counting 613 concepts, right? The mitzvot are all distinct, discrete concepts, not, right? And it doesn't matter if you have repeated verses. This is why the discussion of Olo is relevant to this shortish, right? By contrast, in Olo, where we said we repeated the same thing over and over again, therefore we count it once, right? If you have distinct concepts, then you count them distinctly. But that is on the condition that you have a pasuk, right, that explicitly tells you it's a do not statement, right? But here's the but.
However, if there's a do not that covers many concepts, that only count each do not every concept that is covered by that.
Okay, this is technical. All right, let's see if we can understand it. Right, if you have a do not that tells you don't do lots of things. Here's our example: is lo tachlu adam. right? Which we know means, don't eat before you daven, don't eat the Korban Pesach at a certain time, right? All sorts of laws that derive from Lo Tuchlu Adam. All of those are one Isser, right? One mitzvah of Lo Tuchlu Adam, right? It's a very technical way of thinking about it, but it's not a strange concept. That it's not a strange idea. The concept, i.e., a discrete commandment, needs to be correlated with a pasuk, and then not a pasuk, but a lo ta'aseh statement, like lo tuchlu adam, right? A verb that says don't do the verb. Okay, one verb in a do not verb for one mitzvah, right? But if there's a pasuk that has lots of different laws from lit, that is a prohibition that covers many laws, that only counts once. Just from the word this.
Yeah, this is a law that is not liable for lashes, as I will explain. This is like, do not eat upon the blood. These 5 prohibited concepts are covered by the one do not.
Okay, so it's a very technical way of saying it, but we can sort of summarize it, if you will, quickly. Right? If you have a pasuk that tells you one do not statement, but from which we would derive lots of laws, that only counts as one mitzvah. Okay, that is the second definition that appears in the Sefer HaMitzvot. Right? People see that? Yes. Maybe. No. We'll see. Pay attention. It's coming up. That's a problem. It's very complicated. Okay, but let's see what the Rambam now calls his second definition of the second type of lav shebachalot, right? Which is really our third definition the Rambam is offering. What's his third one? Who wants to read the next paragraph, which I've highlighted definition number 3, the second type. I'll read it short. Second type is one do not that prohibits many attached objects, one after the other. Like, don't do this and that and that and that and that. Right? So if I say, don't do X, Y, and Z, right? That is considered a lav shebachalot. Right? So here we have in third definition, a single do not with multiple attached objects. Right? If you want the technical term for do not, the technical term is a verb in the prohibitive mood. Right? A don't do X, Y, and Z. That is one. That is a lav shebachalot, right? And you treat that. You wouldn't get punished for such a thing. Okay. Right? Because definition number 2 is don't eat upon the blood. From that, we derive lots of different laws. The second one is don't do X, Y, and Z. A pasuk says don't do X or Y or Z.
Yeah, but then you have don't do X.
If you have a pasuk that says don't do X, don't do Y, don't do Z, so that is not on the table. But so, for example, give an example because examples are always helpful here, right? We say don't eat the Korban Pesach na uvushal b'mayim. Don't eat the Korban Pesach raw or cooked, right? So that don't eat it raw or cooked. That's one mitzvah.
Right. But you could have like those hang off of those, right? Like and the equivalent to the second definition, right?
Sure.
Second definition, you have prohibition, right? And then you have branches underneath that cover. You could have, for example, don't eat it raw.
It's rum,
Right, and then right, and then you can have other things that fall out underneath that for that one.
Sure, perhaps right, but again, we're very concerned to have mitzvot psukim here, right? So that's part of what's going on. That's what's motivating. So the Rambam again, is going to offer 3 different definitions, right? An implied definition, implied prohibition, a lo ta'aseh, a do not that covers many laws, that has many laws that sort of come out from it, and one don't do X and Y. Right? Those are 3 different definitions, right? And the third one doesn't appear in the Parsha Mishnah, right? Only appears in the Sefer Mitzvot, and it becomes very, very important, right? And in fact, when we look at the Mishnah Torah, we'll go back to the slide in a second. If you look at the Mishnah Torah, right? You see the Rambam tells us what is a lav shebachalot, and he offers definition number 2 and definition number 3. Definition number 1 has fallen by the wayside. So let's go back to the slide for a sec, right? So again, here we have in the Mishnah Torah, the first definition does not appear. The second and third definitions appear, right? And in fact, once we are sort of attuned to the idea that psukim are important for Sefer Mitzvot purposes, right? It's not surprising that definitions 2 and definitions 3 are the ones that are going to receive more analysis because they're the ones that have to do with psukim. Okay, we have time for one more. We're going to go a little over time, but this is a cool example. We'll do it as fast as we can. But let's see what we can do. Okay, so I just put a picture of the Nazir because that was the most relevant picture that I got. This is David Cohen. David Cohen was a close Talmud Chaber of Rav Kook. who was a most recent famous Nazir, not at all related to what we're talking about, but just a picture to fill our space. Okay, so now let's home in on this last definition of lav shebachalot, right? We had a don't do X, Y, and Z, right? The Rambam tells us that is considered is it a lav shebachalot, but in fact, things get even more complicated from there. The Rambam says sometimes you count X, Y, and Z as distinct mitzvot, and sometimes you count X, Y, and Z as one mitzvah. Okay. Why? So let's see. How does the Rambam tell us? So I sort of mapped it out here. Source number 20. I'll read most of the stuff from here. Right. And the Rambam says the second type, that is our definition 3, but definition 2 in the same mitzvot, is one do not that prohibits many attached objects, one after the other, like don't do this or that. This type, in fact, is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is there are matters in the Talmud that incur lashes for each attached object. You get punished for X, Y, X, you're punished for Y, you're punished for Z. And there are matters that you're only liable one because of the lav shebachalot, right? So the Rambam says, when you have one punishment, right, then we know that is only one mitzvah. When you have multiple punishments, that is separate mitzvah. So it said the Torah says, don't do X, Y, and Z. Chazal tell us that you get makos for each one. That's going to turn out to separate mitzvah, even though it's really a lav shebachalot, meaning you only have one do not statement, right? But if Chazal say you only get one punishment, that's going to be one mitzvah, right? Don't do X, Y, and Z, one punishment for doing them all, one mitzvah. Don't do X, Y, and Z, 3 different punishments, 3 different mitzvahs. Okay, it's not super complicated. It's technical, but it's not. We can sort of understand the punishments are guiding us how we're going to read these. Okay, so let's see an example of this. Let's apply this a little less theoretically than we've been discussing. Back to our favorite discussion of Nazir. Okay, so we have a pasuk by Nazir, and I want you to tell me if this is a lav shebachalot or not. So the pasuk tells us in Sefer B'Midbar, Kol yimei nizro mikol asher yatzeh migefen hayayim v'chartzanim ba'adzad lo yochal. Right, all the days of his nazirut, anything that comes out of the wine of the grapes. I guess grapes has been another running theme tonight, right? Whether it's kartanim, adzag, these are words that we don't really know the meaning of, but apparently means grape skins or grape seeds, right? From the skin to the seed, don't eat. So is that a lav shebachalot? Don't eat anything that comes out of the. Well, I don't know the punishment. Just from the puzzle. Is it a lav? Is it?
Yes.
It is, right? Exactly. It is a lav shebachalot. Don't eat anything that comes out of the grapes, even skin, even the seeds, right? So we have now don't do, or here in this case, it's X, Y, and Z, don't do, right? But it's still the same idea where we have one do not for several different items. Okay. But when we turn to the Mishnah in Nazir in Perek Vav, source number 22, the Mishnah tells us that you are liable for wine themselves, grapes themselves, chartzanim themselves, zagim themselves. Right? You get punished, the Nazir gets punished even if it's just wine, even if it's just grapes, even if it's just zagim, chartzanim, skin, or seeds. So that is now we have a lav shebachalot, right? But each one gets different punishments. So therefore, how many mitzvot are you going to have? Yeah, it turns out to be 5, but whatever. It's all the same thing, right? Right? It's all independent. But source. Then again, we have finally another statement from in the Bavli in this discussion, right? Abaye tells us if you eat grape seeds, you're punished twice. Zag twice. Hartzan and Zag 3 times, right? And Rava says, no, you only get once because this is a lav shebachalot. Wait a second, is Rava agreeing with the Mishnah or disagreeing with the Mishnah? Right? Is Rava saying each one is independent, is punished independently, right, or not? So I'm not sure. We'll talk about this more in a second, but we have perhaps conflicting evidence from the Mishnah and Gemara, although you have to, perhaps we'll see they can be reread in a second. But basically, we have this question. We know now that Nazir, the prohibition of a Nazir drinking wine is a lav shebachalot. Our question is, are we going to count that as one mitzvah because it's one punishment, like the Mishnah sounds like? Or we count that as one mitzvah because it's one punishment, like Rava sounds like, or we can count that as several mitzvot because they have distinct punishments, like the Mishnah, perhaps like a Bible. Okay, people see the question? Yeah, is this one mitzvah or several? What kind of lav shebachol is this? Is this the kind that is counted as one, or the kind that's counted as several? So when we turn to the Sefer Mitzvot, as we have it, this manuscript is the earliest manuscript of the Sefer Mitzvot. Right, the Rambam tells us this is source number 24. He counts no less than 5 different prohibitions on the Nazir as they pertain to the product of the grapevine. Okay, right? If you look in source number 24, right, you can't drink wine, you can't drink moist grapes, dry grapes, hartzanim and zagim, right? 5 different things, 5 different mitzvot. It's a lav shebachol that counts as the punished separately and counts separately. Okay, that sounds very straightforward. Why am I telling you this? In fact, if you look at the Ramban again, you see a whole different perspective. Who wants to take source number 25? This is the Ramban's comments on principle 9. Please.
Someone say from that the counted commandments for the Nazir, wine, moist grapes, dried grapes, harzanim, zayin. 5 mitzvot.
So 5 mitzvot, that's what we have right now. The Ramban is calling Sefer Hamadah here, probably refers to the counting at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah. Right, so we have 5, just like we have in our Sefer Mitzvot, just like we have in our Mishnah Torah. But
Change the mind of what he wrote here and count this one.
wait a second. The Ramban is telling us in his Sefer Mitzvot, how many mitzvot were there? 1. There was only 1. It was a different kind of lav shebachol. It was a kind of lav shebachol that only gets counted once, not the one that we counted 5 times. Wait a second. In fact, this also appears in the position of in the discussion of between Daniel Bavli and Avraham and Rambam, right? For those of you who know, Daniel Bavli is a relatively obscure figure. Was educated in Baghdad, moved to Syria in the early 13th century. Avraham and Rambam was obviously the Rambam's son. Daniel Bavli sent Avraham and Rambam 60 questions about the Rambam's works, 13 of which pertain to the Mishnah Torah, the other 13 to the Sefer Mitzvot, the rest of the Mishnah Torah. And in those discussions, Daniel Bavli has a question, right? And he asks this question to Avraham and Rambam, and in just a throwaway line, and this is source number 26, discussing principle number 12. Here you see tet, right? Al tet, right? Number 2, the ninth, right? He says he counts our nazir. He says our nazir who ate zag and hartzan, right? And that should be the same as our korban pesach nam v'shal inu loka el achat.
It's either one or the other.
Correct. But the question is, how many makot do you get if you eat 2 of them, right? If you eat grapes and if you drink wine and eat grapes or dried grapes and whatever. So correct. But the Rambam tells us if you want to get makot, you have to. You're right. They are somewhat different. But the Rambam, you're absolutely right. But the Rambam is telling us that according to the Daniel Bavli's version of the Rambam, this is a lav shebachol that's only counted once, right? There are not exactly equivalent. You're absolutely right. Thank you for clarifying that. But according to Daniel Bavli, right, the Nazir she'achal zag v'chartzan is the same as the korban pesach example and eino loka el achat, right? So now we have testimony from Daniel Bavli, who lived in Syria, and the Ramban, who lived in Spain, so when he wrote the Sefer Mitzvot, right? So we're talking about the opposite ends of the Jewish world, and they're both telling us what? That it was 1, which means there's a change. There's a change. I mean, there has to be a change. There's no reason. I'm showing both these testimonies to show you that there's no reason whatsoever to believe that they had a mistaken text. Right? We're talking about a guy in his far ends of rabbinic Judaism in Syria, and one at the far end of the other end of the Jewish world in Spain, and they both have a text that has 1 mitzvah here. Yes. Where did they go? What they were? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question. And some people think that they have certain solutions. There's certain ways to think about that. It's complicated. We don't have time for it. I don't have all the answers myself. But what we do know for certain is that the Rambam had 1 mitzvah of Nazir and changed it to 5. Obviously, sticking with the number 613, you need to take certain things out if you're adding certain things in. Now, why did the Rambam count 1? I don't know. But if you look in source number 27 from Chevetz ben Yatzliach, and anyone who was listening closely last week will remember that we discussed this now obscure Rishon who wrote a Sefer HaMitzvot. We don't have all of it. What we have was most of what we have that was published, at least, was published in 1915 by Ben Zion Halper in Dropsy College in what's now part of the University of Pennsylvania. Details don't matter, but we have this guy, Chavetz Ben Yatzliach. Remember from last week, the Rambam blamed one of his mistakes in the Parish of Mishnah in Shvit on Chavetz Ben Yatzliach, which means he relied on Chavetz Ben Yatzliach and he knew him and he thought he was authoritative to a certain degree. And lo and behold, in source number 27, if you, we can see, this is in Arabic, so I didn't put the Hebrew on the page, the Rambam, Chavetz Ben Yatzliach counts one mitzvah of Nazir. Yeah, is there a typo there? Yeah, thank you. Yes, the Chavetz Ben Yatzliach says that Nazir only counts as one, which, okay, so we don't know exactly if the Rambam relied on him, but it wouldn't be surprising that his first counting of the mitzvot, the Rambam relied on Chavetz Ben Yatzliach. After all, in the first draft of the Parish of Mishnah, the Rambam relied on Chavetz Ben Yatzliach, right? So this could be why the Rambam initially counted one, and then would later come back and change his mind based on reasons we have to try and figure out. Okay, one last piece of evidence. If you look in the first edition of the Sefer Mitzvot, right? Scholars who are interested in manuscripts are not just interested in manuscripts, they're also interested in the first printing, right? And the first printing of the Sefer Mitzvot was done in 1510. So why are first printings important? Because these were obviously also done from manuscript, and sometimes the manuscripts that were the basis of the first edition no longer survive. Right. So therefore, if we're looking for all the manuscripts we can get our hands on, we have all the manuscripts we have, and we also have the first edition. The first edition might be evidence, might be witness to a manuscript that's lost. In this case, it is. If you look in source number 28, right? This is in the ninth Shoresh. There is a sentence in the first edition of the Sefer HaMitzvot that is not found in any other edition of the Sefer HaMitzvot. And this sentence pertains exactly to our discussion, right? And I'll read it just for the sake of time. In source number 28, the statement, do not consume it raw or cooked, now mugushal, is one mitzvah, right? That we know the Rambam thinks consistently throughout his life, korban pesach, chot yisurim are one mitzvah. And then we have this line, and so too, all of the do nots incumbent on the Nazir that are covered by the prohibition, anything that is obtained from the grapevine, are a single commandment, because they are all a detail as explained in the Gemara. So there again, now we have even more evidence that the Rambam counted these as just one, right? Whatever manuscript was the basis of the first edition of the Sefer Mitzvot had the idea that they're just mitzvah achat, just one mitzvah, right? So now we know with absolute certainty, as much as you can say this thing, but there's no doubt in my mind, the Rambam changed his mind from counting the Nazir, moving it from 1 to 5. That is moving it from the kind of lava shabachol that counts as only one unit to one that you get punished individually for each one. And in fact, this is the last piece of evidence that we'll wrap up. If you look at source number 29 in the discussion of this very mitzvah, this discussion of lav shabachol of a Nazir actually appears not in the discussion of lav shabachol that is all punished independently, but in the discussion of lav shabachol that counts as one mitzvah. Why would the Rambam discuss the Nazir there? The only reason is because that's where he put the discussion originally, and he didn't want to move those sentences in a later edition. And in fact, when you look in the in Principle 9, I think I can tell you, I can show the words that the Rambam added. So the Rambam says, quoting the Gemara at the top of the page, it says, Abaye said, one who eats chartzan is punished twice, zag twice, zag and a chartzan thrice. Right? And Rava said, violating the lav shabachol does not incur punishment. If I thought that Nazir was one mitzvah, I would stop writing there. And that would make sense in context of where the discussion appears in this part of the Sefer Mitzvot. And then we have the phrase, meaning the statement, anything from the grapevine, which Abaye claimed imposed punishment. Then the Rambam adds, if you're following, I hope you're all following me, this is a little technical. The Rambam adds the following line, that what is not punished more than once, the kol asher yaseh migefen hayan. This extraneous phrase that we don't actually apply to any mitzvah, which means that what I think the Rambam has done here is change the way he read the Gemara in Nazir, the one that's at the top of the page. At first, he said it applies to all the Surei Nazir. right? And then he said, and therefore, they're all lav shebachalad, and they all get punished once, and therefore we count it as one mitzvah. And then he says, wait a second, that Gemara Nazir is only referring to a small set of that pasuk, kol asher yaseh migefen hayayin, right? And therefore, the rest of the prohibitions are distinct mitzvot, and the rest of them should be counted as 5, right? But we're not, and therefore, this is the kind of lav shebachalad that is punished independently. Right? So people see changes happen, right? What I think, I'm almost certain of this as well. This I have no manuscript evidence to support, but I'm almost certain that what's going on here. The Rambam has added several words in this discussion in the wrong place in this principle in order to change the way that Nazir, the kind of lav shebachalad Nazir is. Right? He's changed it from the one kind to the 5 kind. The one kind in line with our text we have on the slide, and in line with Daniel Abavli, and in line with the Rambam, and in line with Chedus Ben Yitzliah. And then he's changed it to the Rambam's position that these are 5 distinct mitzvot. Right? So again, we see here fairly clearly the kind of changes the Rambam has made, and they all are very subtle, and they all require coordinating a lot of different sources. And I think it's important to, and we see, but I think this change is pretty clear, right? We know the Rambam made a change. We can pretty much reconstruct the kind of how he went about making these changes. Right, and obviously it's very significant, as you said. The Rambam is now changing the count of Taryag, and he's pulling some in and pulling some out and putting new ones in. Right, always sticking to the number of Taryag, and this is going to impact how he counts these mitzvot. Figuring out exactly what went out when these went in is requires significant more research, but they must be there. Okay, so what do we take away from all this? Despite, even though it's technical, I think there's a few things. One, obviously, I don't want to conclude this series just by saying, oh, look how we should all go back and think carefully about what our works because obviously that's obviously, right. It's obviously sort of trite to say, oh, just just think carefully when you're writing and feel free to change your mind. These are nice lessons nice ethical lessons perhaps that we can gain from this. But I think also that when we're studying someone like the Rambam, each of these stages is very, very significant, and each of them is like takes account of all of the Gemaras and all of Shas at his fingertips. And the Rambam is a dynamic thinker, and he's constantly rethinking each of these sugyot as they pertain to new problems that he tackled. And I think when we want to understand these people for who they were, right, we have to do our best to get the correct editions, get the correct text, but also with an appreciation that these were people who were constantly rethinking and reevaluating their works as they went on. So that's sort of my Musar spiel at the end. But I hope this was illuminating for what we can know, maybe can't know about the Rambam from all of this. But any other questions?
The editions that we have today.
Yes.
The ones that are to apply a quote or to really sort of number. What does that happen in?
So those are based on, some of them are based on the standard printing came from various manuscripts. Mistakes crept in, and some of them are also even found mistakes from different stages from the Rambam. What I would suggest, if you want to go get a good Mishnah Torah, the best Mishnah Torah is by Shilat, and it's a 2-volume work that I actually don't own, but it's available on alhatorah.org. The website is rambam.alhatorah.org, and in each case where there's a manuscript variant, Shilat tells you what he thinks is the best, and where he tells us that's the best critical edition of this work. Not a lot of sometimes it matters halacha l'maisa, other times it's just getting the right reading of the Rambam, and that's where I would look. When it comes to Parasha Mishnah, Kafach is your best bet. That's sort of published by Besader Cook. It has to be used with a little bit of caution. I don't agree with every single iota there. Yes.
I don't think there's enough answer, but I'm just curious. Take a look at the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is a combination of the Rambam, the Rosh, and the Rif, right? And condensed into the basis, put them together, and then you have the Ramon and so forth. But the question I would have is, what was the basis of looking at the Rambam?
It's an interesting question. I don't think we know all the answers. That the Rambam, the basis was interested, was sort of a very curious mind, and he certainly tried to access as many Rambam manuscripts as he could. In fact, as far as I know, he's the earliest sort of post 13th century figure to quote this exchange between Abraham and Rambam and Daniel Abavli. So he is clearly interested in finding manuscripts of the Rambam as best he could, right? He was clearly very interested in the Rambam. He wrote the Kesef Mishnah. So figuring it, so what he had exactly, some people are trying to answer today, but he certainly was carnivorous, that was what I was looking for, in trying to access Maimonidean manuscripts. Yeah, Mark.
Question going back to the first week, you said it was a fortunate series of events that we have this material, is Mechaniza and Cairo and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
stuff. I had heard that Rambam was a controversial figure in his own lifetime and that Jews burned his works. Do you know how consistent it was and why some works were burned and some were?
But then the Rambam, I guess the controversy was sort of twofold. One was mostly was theological, right? The Rambam was bothered people for centuries. The Rambam sort of Aristotelian positions. When it came to halacha, so those were sort of attacked on their own. When it came to halacha, the critics of the Rambam sort of found his method problematic, mostly because he sort of didn't cite his sources and he spoke in a univocal tone in ways that other Rishonim maybe didn't quite as much when they were writing codes of law, and that was criticized, but it wasn't attacked in the same vociferous way that the philosophical or theological works were attacked. And so those, but if you look and you look at the famous for the Russians, other people sort of derived it, obviously, very early on is criticizing the Rambam for some of his methodology of Psak, but they're not going to that extreme to certainly burn his works.
That burning was
It's debated. There's some questions Rabbeinu Yonah's connection to it. It's a whole thing. It's a whole discussion. I don't have a clear answer to it. There's some scholarship that's been on exactly identifying who and what and when and why, but it's complicated. But it certainly happened. The question is how extensive was it, who supported it, and what exactly would it entailed, right? Some people and they would. Part of the problem was, you throw out Sefer Hamada, which is the most philosophical part of the Mishnah Torah. They would also potentially throw out the rest of it, which is less problematic from a theological perspective, from these guys' perspective. But people like the Rambam stood up in defense of the Rambam, even the theology, even if he disagreed, he certainly defended the Rambam's right to say what he said. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right, thank you for coming. Very much enjoyed doing this. I'll let you take care of the technology. Yeah.
One thing, sorry, before we want to go, one thing I sort of disillusioned is kind of just like another author going through, writing it, rewriting it, making mistakes, correcting.
I don't know the mistake, but
No, but-
fine.
Yeah,
It's
like any other. Any other
human
author,
being.
but I always thought of Rambam, whatever he writes down is, that's what it is.
And maybe that's what makes him so great, is that he was willing to revisit it.
With all the development like this, with correction.
Yeah.
That's why the historian in certain circles.
No, but I think all the Rishonim. Yeah, they all. I mean, stories about Rashi correcting his work. Some of them, sure, they did these things. I mean, they have to because they didn't think they were perfect. They didn't think that everything they said was final.
Many people think Rashi,
No, even the Rambam seemed to what it was open to criticism in the Torah and so on. Right, sure. You read the two and you see that Rambam says it's a less Rambam question. You bring in like the whole discussion. Okay, maybe that's wrong. And maybe wrong. He was like, part of it is I think there were hard and fast answers in every different question. Sometimes we thought there's more than one possible interpretation. If you read,
It seems to go against the risk tenor and.
I don't think so though. I think the Rambam toward the. I think really, I think that the Rambam thought that there was no sort of final word to decide. I think the Rambam was a whole
Evolved.
discussion. But I think the Rambam realized that if you read Gemara, we get different readings from it. And even in general, the Rambam thought that law wasn't subject to definitiveness of perhaps philosophy. So in philosophy, you could be like totally wrong. Rambam, you got it wrong, you did God, good luck. But in halacha, I don't think they had quite.
So as opposed to one perspective.
Yeah, not everyone agrees with my reading. That's the reading that I'm advocating now, which I've written about, and other people, it's not my own, I'm not the one who thinks it, but other people disagree, other people think the wrong one. But also in halacha, that the final word. And maybe
That I studied it, but it seems that's the way.
right, this seems to account for all this stuff, right? That's what I think, but not everyone, other people disagree. They're much opportunity, people tell you that.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
of course.
Thank
What's
you.
your name?
Alan Stern. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you have all of them. I got it there. Thank you for catching the typo. It's hard to sort of get all this. good to have these PowerPoints.
I know it's not your necessarily your field, but I'm curious.
Sure, make sure I went very over, okay.
All right,
No, it's fine, I don't mind.
the whole issue about this time or.
Oh, on the Rambam?
No,
So
no,
if
I
you
got a different question.
Oh, okay.
Just,
But if you look, by the way, in Aaron Adler's dissertation, it was written by Mark, you know, I could send you a copy. He has a whole chapter on the Rambam and Islam, and he thinks that the Rambam became more open to the idea of Islam over time. You'll see.
my question was.
Other people, I mean, Feldblum, is that his name? Mayor Feldblum, probably better than me. The eighties. When you, major, Tommy Prison. Feldbush, I don't know. I'm escaping it. But he has a whole, people discuss this, it's odd.
No, I'm just gonna ask something different. And like I said, I don't know the story or expertise, because when we're talking about the issue of Islam, we're talking about.
Right.
Professor, was trying to say,
Right.
the latest version is up box, it's very